The first time I discovered that waterproof doesn't always mean waterproof was on a spring trip up in the Adirondacks. It was one of those weekends where the forecast promised light showers, but in the mountains that can mean anything, from a passing mist to a biblical flood. I was feeling pretty confident as I packed my gear, new jacket, fresh rain fly for the tent, even a pair of gaiters that claimed to laugh in the face of mud. I remember standing in the driveway, tugging on the zipper of that slick, crinkly jacket, thinking to myself, finally I've got the good stuff. This time I'll stay bone dry. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky was already brooding, low clouds sagging, like wet laundry. The air had that electric smell, damp and sharp, the kind that tells you rain is hiding, just over the ridge. I set off anyway, boots thumping on the soft earth, the first drops tapping lightly on my hood. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Water beaded up on my sleeves and rolled off like the ads had promised. My pack cover was snug, the rain fly tucked neatly away. I actually felt smug, striding through the drizzle, like some kind of backwoods commando, immune to the elements. But then the drizzle thickened, the drops growing heavier, sharper. Within minutes, it was a full-on downpour, the kind of rain that makes the forest floor hiss and sends rivulets racing down every root and stone. I stopped under a spruce to catch my breath, tugging at the zipper on my jacket. That's when I felt it, a cold finger of water sneaking in at the seam by my shoulder, slowly spreading like ink on paper. I told myself it was nothing, just a stray drip, but soon both shoulders had that clammy weight, and my back felt like I'd leaned against a wet log. My waterproof jacket was already surrendering. I pushed on, stubborn as ever, hoping the storm might ease. Instead, it built into one of those all-day soakers, the kind that never lets up, just changes tempo from pounding to steady and back again. By mile 2, my pants clung to my legs like I'd waded into a pond, and each step squelched in my boots despite the so-called waterproofing. With every gust of wind, a chill crept deeper under the layers, until the promise of weatherproof comfort printed on all those gear tags felt like a cruel joke. Still, there was something almost comical about it. The absurdity of striding through the wilderness, decked out in brand new gear that might as well have been tissue paper. I couldn't help but laugh at myself, imagining some gear designer in a dry office somewhere nodding approvingly, while I sloshed like a sponge through the Adirondack mud. By the time I stumbled into the clearing, where I meant to pitch camp, the storm had settled into a steady, merciless rhythm, the kind of rain that doesn't fall in drops anymore, but as a solid sheet, like the whole sky's been tipped over. My so-called waterproof jacket clung heavy to my skin, and when I bent down to unbuckle my pack, water poured off the brim of my hood, straight down my chest. I remember muttering something about waterproof in theory, swamp in practice. Setting up camp in that kind of weather is a test of patience and stubbornness. I yanked the tent bag from my pack, which was supposed to be safely shielded by the waterproof cover. The outside was damp, but when I pulled the fabric free, I realized the seams had wicked water in like little rivers. My tent was already half soaked before it ever hit the ground. Still, I pressed on, hammering stakes into the mud, while the fly whipped around in the wind like an angry flag. When I finally crawled inside, dripping like a dog, fresh out of the lake, I sat there in the dim light, watching tiny droplets push their way through the seams above me. One by one, they swelled until they fell with an icy plop onto my sleeping pad. It was like Chinese water torture, each drop landing just close enough to remind me that my dry night's rest was nothing but a fantasy. I tried to laugh it off, stripping down to my last dry base layer. The tag on the bag had bragged that it would stay warm even when wet, which felt more like a challenge than a guarantee at that point. I stuffed my damp clothes in a corner, crawled into the sleeping bag, and listened. Outside, the forest roared with rain, the ground gurgling like a clogged sink as the water tried to find its way downhill. Every so often, a gust of wind would slap the tent walls, showering me with another sprinkle of icy droplets. Funny thing is, as miserable as it all seemed, there was also a kind of strange peace to it. No one else was out there. Just me, the storm, and a whole lot of leaky promises for my gear. I could smell the wet earth mixing with pine needles, hear the distant creak of trees swaying under the weight of water. In that moment, I realized, there's waterproof and then there's nature. Nature always wins. When morning came, it wasn't with the soft glow of sunlight sneaking through the tent walls like I'd hoped. Instead, it was the dull gray light of a sky still swollen with rain, the steady patter drumming on the fabric above me. My dry corner of the tent had shrunk to about the size of a doormat. Everything else, sleeping bag, extra clothes, even the food bag, had absorbed enough moisture to qualify as wet sponges. I sat up, groggy and stiff, peeling damp nylon from my skin, and I swear even the air inside the tent felt heavy with water. The first order of business was getting a fire going, which I knew was going to be a battle. I stepped outside into the muck, boots squelching with every step, and started hunting around for anything resembling dry tinder. The forest floor was a soggy carpet, each stick dripping, each log blackened with moisture. I finally remembered the trick an old-timer once told me. Look under the deadfall, peel away the wet bark, and scrape the dry shavings hidden inside. Sure enough, I managed to carve out a handful of nearly dry curls, though my fingers were so cold and clumsy they felt like someone else's hands. Getting that fire started was like negotiating with the wilderness itself. I coaxed sparks from my flint and steel, shielded them with my body, whispered every encouraging word I could muster, and still the first few tries fizzled into thin smoke. When the flame finally caught, it was a tiny flickering thing, hardly more than a candle. But to me, it looked like salvation. I hunched over it, feeding it shavings, then twigs, then sticks, until the smoke thickened and a small flame danced against the gloom. Breakfast was nothing more than soggy oats and a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, brewed from rainwater I'd collected off the fly, but it tasted like triumph. The warmth spread back into my hands. The steam fogged my face, and for a moment the misery lifted. And then, of course, nature decided to remind me who was in charge. A sudden gust of wind barreled down the hillside, shaking loose a branch heavy with water. It snapped down right above me, dumping what felt like a whole bucket of icy rain onto my back and snuffing the tiny fire into a hiss of steam. I just stood there, soaked to the bone again, coffee dripping out of my tin mug, and started laughing. There was nothing else to do. Out here, waterproof meant temporary, comfort meant relative, and a laugh was sometimes the only thing that could keep the cold from winning. The trail that morning looked less like a path through the woods and more like the bed of a rushing creek. Water poured downhill, carving little channels between the rocks, gurgling over roots and pooling in every hollow. I stared at it for a good minute, debating if it was worth moving at all, but sitting in a soggy tent with no fire wasn't much of a plan either. So I cinched down my dripping pack, pulled on the boots that squelched with every step, and set off into the deluge. Each stride was its own adventure. The mud sucked at my heels, like it wanted to keep me, while the rain found every weak seam in my jacket to worm its way inside. At one point, I slipped on a mossy stone and landed square in a puddle so deep it might as well have been a pond. When I stood up, water poured out of my pockets like I was carrying tiny waterfalls. I couldn't decide if I was more embarrassed or amused, though with nobody else around. I guess it was just me laughing at myself. A few miles down, the trail crossed a stream that had swollen overnight into a full-blown torrent. What was supposed to be a neat little rock hop crossing had become a brown, churning mess. I stood there for a long while, trying to spot a way across, before finally giving in. I waded straight through, water surging around my thighs, boots filling to the brim. By the time I scrambled up the far bank, I was soaked through to the last thread, head to toe. But here's the funny thing. Once you're that wet, the fear of getting wetter just disappears. I stopped dodging the deep puddles. I stomped straight through the mud, splashing like a kid let loose after a storm. The forest, for all its gray gloom, had a strange kind of beauty in that downpour. Every branch dripping, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth, the mist weaving between the trunks like breath. It wasn't comfortable, but it was alive, raw and unforgettable. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridgeline where the rain finally let up, the clouds tearing open to reveal a sliver of pale blue sky. Steam rose off the ground as if the whole forest was sighing with relief. I dropped my pack, spread out what little gear wasn't hopelessly ruined, and sat back against a boulder. I was still soaked, still chilled, but for the first time that day, I felt like maybe the storm, and I had come to a truce. That evening, the storm finally moved on. The forest dripped quietly, every leaf shaking loose its last drops. The stream still swollen but calming to a steady murmur. I found a small rise above the wet ground, cleared a patch and set my tent again, hoping for a drier night. The fly still smelled of rain, like a damp dog, but I stretched it tight and weighed it down with stones, just in case the clouds changed their mind. Dinner was simple, if you could call it that. A half-soggy bag of trail mix, some cheese that had turned into a waterlogged lump, and a tortilla that tore in two as soon as I unwrapped it. But I ate with the kind of hunger that only comes after miles of slogging in the rain, and somehow it all tasted fine. As the sky dimmed, streaks of orange light broke through the last of the clouds, and for the first time in what felt like days, the world glowed warm again. I sat there barefoot, boots turned upside down to drain, and watched the steam rise from the soaked ground. The trees glistened like they'd been polished, every needle and leaf catching the sunset. A hermit thrush started calling from the shadows, its fluted notes echoing through the dripping forest, and I felt that rare kind of calm, the kind you only get after being thoroughly humbled. The funny part is, looking back, I wouldn't trade that trip. Sure, the gear betrayed me. Sure, I spent more time wringing out my socks than enjoying the trail. But there was something pure in the fight against the storm, in learning firsthand that waterproof is just a promise the wilderness laughs at. I discovered that once you accept being wet, you stop worrying about it so much. You keep moving, you laugh at the absurdity, and you find beauty even when your boots are sloshing like buckets. When I finally crawled into my damp sleeping bag that night, the sky was clear, stars burning sharp and bright above the treetops. I fell asleep to the sound of the forest drying out, the cool air brushing my face, and a strange gratitude welling up inside me. Because sometimes the best stories, the ones you keep telling, by campfires years later, are born not from comfort, but from the moments when nature reminds you that you're small, that you're vulnerable, and that you're lucky just to be out there at all.